Hi, my name is Eva Steiner and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to... Thank you for taking this time for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Eva. My name is Anna. I am a mental health practitioner in New Zealand. I am registered with the International Council of Integrated Psychotherapists, which is a UK-based company. So I'm registered with them as a psychotherapist. So I have started my studies in South Africa and I have gone to New Zealand about 10 years ago. So I am a citizen there. So what I would like to do is I would actually like to do a Maori introduction. Culture is really important in New Zealand. And one of those things that is really lovely is basically to introduce yourself in a certain way. And in that way, it is to actually see where you can connect with people. Basically, the introduction is tēnā koe, because it's only you, it's one person, but if it's to the audience as well, it would be tēnā koutou katoa, which is greetings to you all. At Drakensberg, tōku maunga, so Drakensberg is my mountain, ko Val tōku awa, so the Val River is my river, no Auckland ahau, I live in Auckland, ko Ana tōku ingoa, Ana is my name, no reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So this is greetings to you, greetings to the audience, and basically greetings to everyone. So that is the greetings we have here in New Zealand. So when I came to New Zealand, it was really fantastic to sort of link up with this new culture and to be trained in this new culture as well. In New Zealand, culture is not only about Maori culture, it's also about my culture from South Africa, and to join them together to see how we can make those connections. So that is one of the big things that I really appreciate about the New Zealand culture, and finding myself within New Zealand, within this beautiful new culture, and bringing something with me as well.
So tell me a little bit about New Zealand culture. What is some holiday or tradition that the New Zealand celebrates? And if New Zealand would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
New Zealand to me is happy. It's free because people go out. They go on walks. They're very outdoorsy people. New Zealand is a beautiful country, and going outdoors, doing beautiful walks in the forests, all those kind of things is really what New Zealand is about. It's really part of that culture. So for me, that is, what the emotion of New Zealand would be. So in New Zealand, we've got a few main holidays that is celebrated. So the first one is Christmas. Christmas is in New Zealand a very celebrated time of the year. It's when families get together, and it's really wonderful for me as well. That's when I see my family. We try to link with people all across the world. It's also part of the New Zealand culture where your family is generally spread around the world as well. So Christmas is that time to get people together. The next one is New Year. New Year is celebrated, I think, mainly in New Zealand by the young people when they go out and they celebrate New Year and they have a party. In New Zealand, because they are so laid back, we have got New Year's Eve, which is generally taken as a holiday. Then we have New Year's Day, which is a public holiday. But then we have the day after New Year's, which is also a public holiday.
And this day of the New Year is after the 2nd of January? Or?
So the 1st of January is New Year's Day. That is a public holiday. And then it's the day after New Year. So the 2nd. The 2nd of January, which is also part of this New Year celebration. So New Year is quite big in New Zealand. And then we also have Matariki, which is the Maori New Year, which is really lovely. It's generally celebrated on Friday, and this year it was the 25th of June. So Matariki is a time of rebirth. It's a time where it also has to do with the star alignment, and that is really beautiful for Matariki to be celebrated specifically by Maori. And it's quite a big thing in New Zealand, Matariki as well. So that's great. So we get to have not only 3 New Year's days in the beginning of the year, but we also have in the middle of the year the Maori New Year, which is also greatly celebrated in New Zealand.
Do you feel that all the ethnicities are integrated in New Zealand, like well, and all have the same rights?
I think they do have the same rights. It's a complicated question because when you look at New Zealand, it's an integrated society, which is really lovely. I always look at New Zealand and think that it's a model for other countries to see what integration can look like. At the same time, we have got minority groups, which is overrepresented when it comes to being imprisoned, when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to poverty as well. So I think as much as New Zealand is really working hard towards an equal society, I think those inequalities unfortunately still exist. However, that being said, I think most people try to integrate into this beautiful society.
How did you become a psychotherapist, and what is your therapeutic approach?
I became a psychotherapist because I needed psychotherapy when I was younger. And I just thought it was a great way, like paying it forward. It was really just a wonderful experience for me to realize, I can actually talk to somebody and I can feel better. I think not all approaches suit everybody. And I've noticed that the approach that I used when I was younger, which is the CBT technique, doesn't really work for everyone. So I'm an integrative psychotherapist. I have training in all sorts of therapy, CBT, ACT, DBT, narrative psychotherapy. Since I've been to New Zealand, they have got the most beautiful indigenous psychotherapies as well. So I'm trying to use all the different modalities in my therapeutic approach. And interestingly, lately I've also found that there's quite a lot of people that's coming to therapy that actually ask for relationship therapy in terms of polyamory. So that was a new learning for me. I had to learn more about polyamory, and my repertoire of therapy, so to speak, has now increased yet again to learn more about what my clients need. So that's where I go. I go where they are, and then I train myself up to make sure that I can meet their needs. So I walk alongside them. I use a lot of motivational interviewing, Socratic inquiry, and then I use the tools of CBT, DBT, all those kind of things with my clients and see what works for them.
And in general, in New Zealand, how can someone become a psychotherapist?
In New Zealand, there's a few pathways. You can become a counsellor, and then you register with the Counsellor Society. It's called the New Zealand Association of Counsellors. You also have the Christian Association of Counsellors. Then you become a counsellor in those organizations. There's university studies for all those kind of fields. So the counselling degrees, and I think there's a master's degree for that as well. In terms of psychotherapy, the same applies. There's a specific academic route to get to be a psychotherapist. I think you do counselling, I'm not sure, or psychotherapy undergraduate, and then you do your honors in psychotherapy, and then you do your master's in psychotherapy. And that includes practical internship as well. The same with psychologists. They also get up to a master's and some a doctorate to become psychologists in New Zealand. And then they also have to have that internship. So in New Zealand, it's quite an academic process to be a counsellor, psychotherapist, or a psychologist.
And I assume because it's so, how should I say, structured, there is also a law for psychology, psychotherapy, and counseling, or am I wrong?
That's right. Yeah. So a psychotherapist is a protected title in New Zealand, and psychologist is also a protected title, but counsellor is not a protected title. So you can obviously practice in any field that you are trained in, So if you are trained as a counselor, you can still practice as a counselor. But as a counselor, you can't call yourself either a psychologist or a psychotherapist. There's also different registration categories for psychologists. So you get counseling psychologists, health psychologists, clinical psychologists, rehabilitation psychologists, and so on, general psychologists. So there are different categories of registrations in New Zealand. It is quite difficult, though, for people to come from other countries into New Zealand and become a psychologist, for instance, registered as a psychologist or registered as a psychotherapist elsewhere. Often people have to re-qualify in New Zealand to get into those roles, to become a psychologist or psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean exactly? Requalify, that you take a few exams, or you need to go from the beginning?
When I went to New Zealand, I was already trained as a psychologist, so my qualification wasn't accepted. I re-qualified. I did a rehabilitation psychology degree, but I couldn't get to go into the internship, unfortunately. So you've got to basically re-qualify. And the same for psychologists as well. I know some psychologists who came from countries like Scandinavia, trying to be a clinical psychologist, for instance, in New Zealand, and they had to requalify as well. So it depends, I guess, from country to country. Sometimes you can get into New Zealand and go and register as a psychologist, depending on where you studied and what the specific papers are. It would be great if they had like a bridging course to go from this qualification that you have to the one that they would then accept. But often it's a requalification, which is quite sad.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
I think in New Zealand, in some instances, there are still people who look at it with skepticism, but generally it's widely accepted. When you look, for instance, at Jacinda Ardern, she took some of the mental health issues that we experience in New Zealand, and she discussed it openly in the world stage, which I think is really great. Mental health is really important in New Zealand. In New Zealand, we have something called a work-life balance, which is really important, and a lot of companies bring that into their culture, their company culture, so that people look after their work life, but also their home life. Overall, people accept that sometimes you do need help, which I think is great in any society for people to have that attitude.
And how is help available? Through like a public health system, or it's a private pay, or both?
New Zealand has a private health system that is not used as much, but it also has the public health system. And the public health system works through what is called ACC. And we also have a national health system as well. So when you have an accident, you claim through the Accident Compensation Fund, which is the ACC. That can be car accident or accidents in the home or private accidents. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a work accident. Any accident will be covered by that. But then you also have the National Health Service, which is generally free. Fortunately, like in most countries, there can be a bit of a waiting list. But even with mental health, people can claim through the National Health Service for mental health treatment and for general doctor's appointments. It depends on where you are. The areas that are not as affluent as other areas, they would have more benefits when it comes to doctors. So the National Health Service will pay the doctors more in those areas. So the proportion the clients would pay would then be less. And that also applies to psychologists. They can also work through either ACC or they can work through the National Health Service, as well as the psychotherapists and certain counselors as well. So it's not only psychologists and psychotherapists, but also counselors can link into those systems.
Have you noticed any mental health stigma?
Some people can still have the stigma, but mainly the perception is very favorable for people who need mental health. So as I mentioned, Jacinda Ardern as well, she went on the world stage and spoke about suicide cases in New Zealand and the kind of help needed for those people and where it came from. So I thought that was really favorable in terms of, mental health, how it's viewed in New Zealand. There's quite a few organizations that's available as well for people with mental health illness that's free of charge, like Bernardo's, a WhatsApp free line for children. Bernardo's are also free for children. And then just various mental health services that's been made available, free services and online services as well for people with mental health issues, like the depression and anxiety group and child helplines and those kind of things.
What is the society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether these values of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
In our society in New Zealand, there's a lot of independence given to children. The general corporal punishments that people had in the past, those no longer exist, and it's not legal in New Zealand for school to have corporal punishment. Around 2007, that also stopped for parents to have corporal punishments in home. So in New Zealand, it's more of a negotiation relationship. Parents and children, they both take on chores in the home. There's more of an independence when children go to universities. A lot of children actually pay for their own studies. Parents can assist as well. And children, they are trained to be free and to do their own things. That independence is cultivated from a young age. That would include in therapy as well. So it's very important for therapists to have very clear rules when it comes, or boundaries when it comes to children. What is negotiated with the parents, what information are given to parents. Of course, not all information will be provided with parents when the children want to have that private intervention. But all those need to be negotiated before the time. And sometimes parents don't get any information when it comes to treatment of children. The only time that it's really important for a therapist to divulge information is if there's harm to the child, the child is unsafe, or if the child wants to harm themselves, or if a criminal activity happened within the home or around the child. That information would be divulged to either the parents or the police. And again, that will be described in detail before the session starts, so that the children and the parents know exactly what they're in for.
And if an adult client would come to you and say, I don't want to see my parents anymore, I want to cut contact with them, how would the society look upon such a request, and how would you approach as a therapist?
If it's an adult client, I think it depends. What is it that the adult client experienced with their parents? Sometimes if adults treated children really badly and it was severe abuse, or if it's a really toxic relationship, then that adult has got the right to decide not to see their parents. I will go alongside the client. I'll be guided by them, hear their story to find out what happened for them in their lives, and they can make that decision. I think in New Zealand, people won't automatically judge. I think they want to hear the story first. The people that I've worked with, society in general, I'm not sure how they would respond. I think it depends from person to person, and also hearing somebody's story could get you a better understanding of why people behave the way they do.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
I was trained, and I know that my colleagues, like the psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, we are all trained that the therapeutic relationship is the therapeutic relationship. Once you start seeing people outside of therapy, it is no longer a therapeutic relationship. It becomes a friendship, and therapy with friends are not encouraged. Also, having a client and that becoming a friendship, that is not encouraged at all. A lot of problems can happen within those relationships, and a lot of ethical dilemmas, including like the power imbalance. Especially if somebody came to you in a very vulnerable position and all of a sudden you start seeing them outside of therapy, that is highly discouraged and is part of the ethical dilemmas that we are presented with during training as well. So whether it's a friendship relationship or whether it's a sexual relationship, it is completely discouraged. And I agree with that, because somebody come to you with a certain problem and they're quite vulnerable within those situations. And I believe that if you are a therapist, it could be quite an abuse of that relationship. And that, I think, is a general perception in New Zealand with counsellors, psychotherapists and psychologists, to have those strict boundaries around friendships after therapy.
And in case of the abuse, so the therapist is the one that is crossing the line, is there any institution where the client can turn to?
Yes, absolutely. So should that happen, should there be an abuse within the relationships, I think it's really important for our clients to make sure that they go to a counsellor, a psychologist or psychotherapist that is registered, because there's safety for them in going to somebody who's registered somewhere. It is quite easy for a client to escalate abuse client-therapist relationships by simply going to the websites and complete complaint forms, and their cases will then be heard in confidence, and then the psychologists or, the health professional will then be called in, and that will be discussed with them and investigated. Should there be a case and where a professional overstepped their boundaries, then various things can happen. They can be retrained in specific ethical areas, depending on what it is, to actually just struck off the roll. And their license, if it's a psychologist and psychotherapist in New Zealand, they have licenses. Those licenses can be revoked. So there can be quite serious consequences when there are ethical dilemmas within the psychotherapeutic practice.
And in case, let's say, that you witness or you see your colleague therapist crossing the line, are you obliged to report the colleague, or what is the obligation here?
Yes, it's not bringing the profession into disrepute, and that's also across the board. If you notice a colleague behaving a certain way, inappropriately towards somebody else, it is required to first approach the person. It may be that the person didn't know that they were doing that, and then they can work on it themselves. And then once that person continues that, you can take it to a supervisor if you have a mutual supervisor or employer. If not, you can then take it to your registration body. Or if I see a psychologist, I'm not registered as a psychologist, but if I notice ethical misconduct by a psychologist, I can also report that to the psychologist board. And that is the importance of mental health professionals being registered at a specific board.
Is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
Yes, whether you are a counselor or whether you're a psychotherapist or a psychologist, it is a requirement when you belong to those bodies or associations that you do get supervision. With my registration body as well, I need at least 13 sessions a year of supervision. I have 2 supervision sessions a month, actually, so it's more than the required sessions. The reason for that is to keep your practice safe, so that if you have problems and you don't know what to do, you have got that extra set of ears and mind to help you with your practice. So it's just responsible practice to have the supervision. And I find it incredibly helpful for myself as having my own private practice. It's important for me not to be all on my own and to have that supervisor as well.
What are the most common complaints that the clients come to therapy for?
In my practice, it's mainly depression and anxiety. I also deal quite a lot with trauma as well, especially childhood trauma or learned behavior that they bring into their adult life. So childhood experiences can have an impact on adult life. So the modalities that I do use when I work with my clients is somatic therapy, that's specifically with the trauma, but also CBT is really great when you look at your thoughts, your thinking, and your behavior. And a lot of those core beliefs stem from childhood. It's great to look at the childhood, where core beliefs are formed, and then how it affects the rest of the client's lives.
Is there any collective trauma in New Zealand that you are witnessing?
In New Zealand, there is collective trauma, especially when it comes to the minority groups and to Maori as well. Quite a lot of things had happened in the past when it comes to Maori. For instance, examples of those are that about 30, 40 years ago, children were discouraged from speaking Maori in school. It's called Te Reo Maori. Also, people were removed from their close-knit family environments, and that created quite a lot of trauma. So in New Zealand, because it's Maori is such a collective society, once people were taken out of those societies and brought, I believe it was in the 60s, but I stand to be corrected, when they were brought into the city environment, those collective support systems were no longer there for them. And I believe that is when a lot of gangs also started, which could be, it's still a topic of discussion, but that could have led to the gang formations in the larger cities during those times. So that would all be part of that collective trauma, being isolated from society, and also the language. In New Zealand at the moment, there is such a rebirth when it comes to speaking Te Reo Maori. It was suppressed, and now there's a beautiful pride when it comes to speaking Maori and getting all the old customs back.
If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
Yes, I think as a therapist, it's important to listen. I think people are not listened to much, and I think people are told what to do often. So coming to a therapist, for a therapist, and for me, walking alongside the client, hearing their stories and helping them get to their own solutions is really important to me. What I've learned, I can offer them the tools, but not all tools, not everything works for everyone. So it's important for me to be able to offer something. It's like if somebody's in a sea swimming, just throw the rope, hold it tight, and let them climb on the boat. Let them decide how they want to get back to safety.